In this lesson, we are working on solving equations with the quadratic formula and then taking a look at the discriminant. Remember, the quadratic formula is used to solve quadratic equations, which are equations to the second power. So we would be solving equations that look like y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. So it's to the second power, knowing that the a is the coefficient or the number in front of the x squared, the b is in front of the x, and the c is the constant term by itself. And in order for us to solve a quadratic equation, we also have to remember that it has to be set equal to 0. The quadratic formula, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. The discriminant is simply the part that's under the radical. It's the b squared minus 4ac. The word discriminant, or to discriminate, means that we're setting it apart. And the reason that we have the importance for the discriminant is that if the answer is positive under the radical, then there are going to be two solutions. For example, if under the radical there was a positive 4, we know that the square root of 4 could be a plus or a minus 2. If the answer under the radical is negative, we used to say that there was no solution in the real number system. But now, because we've talked about imaginary numbers, since it's a negative, we could have two imaginary solutions. For example, if this was the square root of negative 9, we could have plus or minus. Remember that the square root of 9 is 3 and the square root of a negative is I. Then if there is 0 under the radical, then there would be one solution, because the square root of 0 is 0. 0 is neither positive nor negative. So in the first example, we want to find the number of solutions by using the discriminant and then solve using the quadratic formula. First thing we have to do is set it equal to 0, so we're going to subtract 1 from each side. So we have x squared plus 3x minus 1 equals 0. So we're going to use the discriminant first, which is just the b squared minus 4ac. So the b value is 3, the a value is 1, the c value is negative 1. So b value being 3 would be 3 squared minus 4, a value is 1 since that's the coefficient of the x squared, and then c is negative 1. So we have 9, and negative 4 times 1 times negative 3 would be positive 4, so we get 13. Since that's positive, we know that there are going to be two solutions. So when we solve the entire quadratic formula, it becomes a little bit easier for us to do. We have negative b, so that's going to be the opposite of b, which is negative 3, plus or minus the square root of 13, which is under the radical, all over 2 times a, and 2 times 1 is 2. So that would be our two solutions, negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 13 divided by 2. Or if we are actually looking for the solutions, we're going to want to use our calculator to find our decimal equivalents. So we can do that, and then we also want to make a sketch of what this looks like. And so what we want to talk about is that when we look at our first equation and remembering our quadratic, that it opens up because our coefficient of x is positive. And all we're going to do is want to make a sketch, even though we don't know where exactly the vertex is. We're not worried about that at this time. So if you use your calculator and plug in the information, we'd have -3, first of all, plus the square root of 13. Make sure you press equals and then divide that by 2. So I get 0.30277, so about 0.3. And if I do the negative, I have -3 minus the square root of 13. Press equals and then divide that by 2. And we get -3.3, approximately. So I'm going to put 0.3 and 1, 2, 3, -3.3. And my parabola is opening up because it is a quadratic. And that would be my sketch. Okay, in the next example, -x squared plus 2x minus 1. So first we're going to find the discriminant, which is b squared minus 4ac. My quadratic is equal to 0, so I'm ready to go. So here's my a, here's my b value, here's my c. So my b is 2, so that's going to be 2 squared minus 4 times a is -1 times c is -1. So I have 4, and then -4 times -1 times -1 would be -4. So my discriminant is 0, so that's going to be one solution. And that also means that that is going to be the vertex. We look at our quadratic, it's negative, so we know that that's opening down. So let's finish the quadratic formula. X equals -b, so that's going to be -2 plus or minus the square root of 0 all over 2 times a is -1, so that's going to be -2. 0 plus or minus 0, so we have -2 over 2, which is 1. So my 0, which is my solution to my quadratic equation, x equals 1, so it's going to be at the point 1, 0. So when I graph that, I have the point 1, 0, and it's opening down. Since there is only one solution, which is one x-intercept, which is 1, 0, that's going to be our vertex also. Okay, next, in this example, we're going to do our discriminant b squared minus 4ac. It is already equal to 0. So this is my a value, and this is my c value, so that means that b is equal to 0. So we have 0 squared minus 4 times a is 1 times 3, which is our c value. So we're going to get an answer of -12, which means we have two imaginary solutions. And when they are imaginary, that means they will not cross the x-axis. So let's finish our quadratic formula. X equals -b, that's 0, plus or minus the square root of -12 all over 2 times a, 2 times 1 is 2. So we are going to take the square root of 12, and if we simplify that with a factor tree, so we get 2i square root of 3, and we'll do a plus or minus, divided by 2, which means that's going to be plus or minus I square root of 3 over 2. And that's going to be our solutions, plus or minus I square root of 3 over 2. So the square root of 3 divided by 2 is approximately 0.9, so it's going to be plus or minus 0.9i. Now, this is opening up, and when it's opening up, it cannot cross the x-axis because the solutions are imaginary, and since we have no b value, we're just going to open like this, and that'll be our sketch. Opens up, does not cross the x-axis. All right, in our next example, the first thing we have to do is make sure it's set equal to 0. So we're going to add x to both sides. So we have 5x squared plus x plus 9 equals 8, and then we're going to subtract 8 from both sides. I did this in 2 steps to make sure you understood what I was doing, but I would probably have added x and subtracted 8 at the same time. My a value, my b value, my c value. So let's do the discriminant. B squared minus 4ac. B value is 1. A value is 5. My c value is 1. So I have 1 minus 20, which equals negative 19. So we know that there are going to be 2 imaginary solutions. We also know that our parabola is going to open up. So if we finish the quadratic formula, we have x equals negative b, which would be negative 1 plus or minus the square root of negative 19, all divided by 2 times a, 2 times 5 would be 10. So negative 1 plus or minus the square root of negative 19 all over 10. Since it's opening up, and since these are imaginary, it's also very narrow, we can make that parabola sketch. We don't need to worry about the decimal on this one. So if you would please continue by completing student problems 1, 2, and 3 of this video.